Hello, my name's Sarah Marsden and I work in the Department of Politics, Philosophy and Religion at Lancaster University. And in these two short presentations, I'm going to introduce you to the history of politics in the United Kingdom and describe how Parliament works. Now, politics is very often about power, who has it, who gives it to them, and how it's used. In the UK, the story is one of power moving over a very long period of time from the hands of one person, the king, to the people who are represented by individuals that they elect to represent them in Parliament. So in these presentations, I'm going to introduce some of the history about British politics and talk about how we, as people living in the UK, can have a say. In this first talk, we're going to look at who's in charge and who put them there. But first, some history. 800 years ago, this was the man that was in charge. This is King John, and he had absolute power. He could take money from you by raising taxes without asking. He could arrest you or even put you in prison. He could even have people killed, and there was very little that most people could do about it. Today, this is our monarch, Queen Elizabeth II. Now, Queen Elizabeth has very little political power. Her role is mainly ceremonial. Instead, the country is run by a parliament, which is elected by the people who live in the United Kingdom. And this is called a constitutional monarchy and parliamentary democracy. Now, those terms might sound quite complicated. What does that mean? What changed? And why does it matter? Well, to understand that, we need to go back in history. 800 years ago, King John fell out with a group of powerful people in the country. And in the end, they forced him to sign something called the Magna Carta in 1215. This was called the Great Charter, and for the first time, it meant that the king had to obey the law. 50 years later, there was the first Parliament. Another man called Simon de Montfort had taken power in the country. And at this Parliament, for the very first time, people from across England were invited to represent the views of the people who lived where they were from. And Parliament, of course, comes from the French word to parler or to talk, and that's what they very often did in parliaments. Now, those people who were invited by Simon de Montfort to come to advise the king met separately from the lords or nobles who'd previously held power. So you had two houses who met separately, the citizens who met in the House of Commons and the lords or nobles who sat in the House of Lords. And that was the very starting point for the modern structure of Parliament, which is still divided today into the House of Lords and the House of Commons. However, these were all still very rich and powerful people. Ordinary folks like you and me had no say over what was happening in the country. But over time, this changed, and the House of Commons, with the citizens represented, gradually became more powerful than the House of Lords or nobles. And in 1430, a law was made that meant that some people, who again were very wealthy, could actually vote on who represented them. And time passed, and in the 1600s, a group of people called the Levellers were the first to demand that everybody should be able to have the vote, not just those who were rich. In 1689, a law called the Bill of Rights was agreed, and this gave the Parliament power over the king, and it meant that the king or queen was controlled by Parliament. And that was the start of the country becoming what was called a constitutional monarchy. And that means that the monarch shares power with the government. The government makes laws and runs the country, while the monarch is the head of state and today has little real power. However, the United Kingdom still wasn't a democracy. In the 1600s, only around 2% of people were able to vote, and it took a very long time for that to change. But it began to change in the 1800s. Up until then, as I've said, the rich and powerful were still in charge, and working people had few rights and little say in how the country was run. But the 1800s was a time of great change in industry, economics and politics, but Parliament remained the same as it had for many years. And in the early 1800s, fewer than 500,000 people were able to vote in a country that was made up of 24 million. So you can see how very few people actually had a say in what was happening. You needed to be rich to vote, and the number of voters in different areas of the country wasn't fairly divided. In the early 1800s, the vote was also open, which meant that anybody could see how you voted. So you might feel pressured into voting one way or another, and intimidation and sometimes violence occurred. People demanded change, and eventually in 1832 the Great Reform Act was passed, and that meant that men who were from the middle classes and who paid around £10 in rent were able to vote. But that still only meant that 3.3% of the population were able to vote, and people continued to fight for change. And a very important movement that tried to change how politics worked in the UK was called the Chartists, and they had a charter which demanded that all men were given the vote, and that votes should be secret, and that those who weren't wealthy should also be in a position to become a member of Parliament. Now, the Chartists weren't successful, and many of its leaders were imprisoned or exiled. However, over the next 50 years following the 1832 Reform Act, a series of further bills were passed that gave the vote to more and more people who had lower incomes, until in 1918 the Representation of the People Act meant that all men over the age of 21 and women over the age of 30 were able to vote. In 1928, all men and all women over the age of 21 were finally able to vote for members of Parliament. And the final change in voting rights came in 1970, when the voting age for all people was lowered to 18. So this is a short story of how the United Kingdom went from being a tyranny, where one powerful man ruled the country, to a democracy, where we all have a say in what happens out in the country. But who carries out the will of the people, and how do they do it? Well, in the UK we have what's called a representative democracy. And that means that all eligible voters choose who represents their interests in Parliament. And the reason we have that system is that there are over 66 million people living in the country, and it'd be really difficult if all those people were asked their opinion every time a decision needed to be made. So instead of that, we represent people by voting for them, and they sit in Parliament and help run the country. The UK is also described as a liberal democracy, and that means there are certain standards that have to be upheld when we're voting for people in Parliament. That means, in practice, that there should be regular elections, which should take place every 5 years, that the voting is secret so no one else can see who you vote for. And you have a choice of people to vote for. So, in the UK, we have a democracy where the people elect members of Parliament to represent our interests. And altogether, there are 650 members of Parliament, or MPs, that the people in the UK vote for. Each of those MPs represents what's called a constituency, and that's a specific area of the country represented by a single MP, and where around, depending on which part of the country you're talking about, 70,000 people live. So, for example, Lancaster and Fleetwood is a constituency. Each MP is normally a member of a political party. There are some independents, which means that they're not associated with a party, but most do belong to some form of political group. Now, there are quite a lot of political parties in the UK which are represented in this chart. But there are probably two main parties. That's the Conservative Party, represented in blue, led by Boris Johnson, and the Labour Party, led by Keir Starmer, represented in red on this chart. And these are the results of the most recent election in the UK. In addition to those two main parties, there are a range of smaller parties. These include the Liberal Democrats, which again is a national party, and a number of parties that represent constituencies in different parts of the country. So the SNP, or the Scottish Nationalist Party, operates in Scotland, the DUP, or the Democratic Unionist Party, in Northern Ireland, along with Sinn Féin, and Plaid Cymru in Wales, as well as a smaller number of other parties. Now, the government is made up of the party with the most MPs voted for by the people in the country. And at the moment, that is the Conservative Party. And the Prime Minister is the leader of the winning party. And at the moment, that's Boris Johnson. But to help him run the country, the government has a cabinet. And this is a group of senior ministers who look after different government departments, like education or health. And finally, the opposition is the party that's not in charge. Here, at the moment, that's Labour. Their job is to make sure that the government do their job properly and to challenge them when they don't. So in this first presentation, we've seen how over a very long period of time, power has gradually shifted from one person to the people. And we've learned how the UK became a democracy through changes that took place over many years, but were importantly influenced by the demands of the people who wanted change and wanted their rights and their thoughts and their interests to be represented. In the next presentation, we'll look in more detail at how Parliament works and what role we can play in politics.